Warsaw's wild boar crisis, mass cull of 3,000 animals, sparks outrage across Poland's capital. Warsaw is facing an escalating urban wildlife crisis as authorities move forward with a controversial operation to cull up to 3,000 wild boars roaming the city. Now it's time to dig deeper and understand the full story through this AI podcast.
Imagine stepping out of your apartment building on like a crisp Tuesday morning. Yeah, you've got your coffee in one hand, you're walking your dog, or maybe you're dropping the kids off at the local playground.
Right, just a totally normal, mundane morning.
Exactly, a completely mundane urban routine.
Yeah.
But then you turn the corner and you are face to face with a 200-pound wild boar.
Oh, man. Which is terrifying.
Terrifying, right. Now, I want you to multiply that image. Imagine not just one, but 3,000 of these massive, prehistoric-looking animals just freely roaming the streets.
Wow, 3,000.
Yeah, 3,000 of them in the parks, the neighborhoods, everywhere in your city. And as of March 2026, you really don't have to imagine this if you live in Warsaw, Poland, because this is just a typical Tuesday.
It is an incredibly striking visual, and it really forces us to completely reevaluate our mental map of what a modern city actually is.
It really does. So today we're taking a deep dive into the research to figure out how a major European capital accidentally transformed into basically a megafauna sanctuary.
Right.
And we're going to look at why the city's drastic response to this invasion is currently tearing the community apart. Because we've got some great sources today, and they show that this isn't just, a quirky animal control story.
No, not at all.
It's a highly complex, incredibly volatile collision between public safety, urban ecology, and some deeply held beliefs about animal welfare.
Yeah, it's a massive issue.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the sheer outrage boiling over in Warsaw right now, we first have to understand the scale of what is actually happening on the ground. 3,000 wild boars in a city center is staggering.
It really is an unprecedented number for an urban space.
And we are talking about districts like Bomowo and Mokotów. I mean, these are heavily populated, densely packed residential areas.
Right.
So the presence of these animals has shifted from being this rare, maybe slightly novel event to a constant, unavoidable daily reality.
And the physical footprint of that reality is just massive. I mean, the threshold for municipal action usually relies on a specific risk matrix. For a long time, officials could kind of write this off as a fringe nuisance, like, oh, a boar was spotted near the woods.
Right. No big deal.
Exactly. But when wildlife encounters transition from isolated sightings to daily, systematic property destruction and imminent physical threats, city officials are essentially forced into a corner.
And let's be really clear about what a wild boar can actually do, because I think we deal with urban wildlife all the time. Raccoons, stray cats, foxes, stuff like that.
Sure.
But a boar is not just, a scaled-up raccoon. They possess an immense amount of kinetic energy and raw strength. They are rooting up entire manicured lawns in a matter of hours.
Oh, yeah, they act like a plow.
Literally.
Right.
And they're physically tearing down residential fences, and they are actively attacking dogs. There are even widespread reports of them causing significant structural damage to vehicles.
Which brings up a completely different, very painful dimension to this whole problem, which is the financial sting. The real kicker for residents is that standard municipal and auto insurance policies usually do not cover these specific wildlife incidents.
Because it's an act of nature or something.
Exactly. It's often classified as an act of nature.
So if a 200-pound boar totals your car or completely destroys your property line, you are left paying for that entirely out of pocket.
Yep.
That is infuriating. I mean, I'd be so mad. But it makes me wonder, and I really want to push back on the city's narrative here for a second based on our sources.
Okay.
Is this strictly a life or death public safety issue like the local government claims? Or is the city just tired of paying for torn up municipal parks and fielding thousands of angry calls from citizens about car repair bills?
Well, I mean, it's a fair question. And
Yeah.
it gets to the exact tension at the heart of municipal management. From the city's perspective, it is impartial. Cold math.
Cold math, yeah.
Their primary mandate, legally and ethically, is to prioritize human safety and maintain urban infrastructure. When you have animals of this size causing this much damage, the probability of a fatal human encounter just rises exponentially.
Because they're everywhere.
Exactly. The city has to act to mitigate that risk. They simply cannot allow apex foragers to dictate the safety of municipal zones.
I get that. But the way they are acting is what has absolutely ignited the public. Let's look at the methodology of this operation, because it sounds like something pulled straight out of a dystopian sci-fi novel.
It really does.
So, residents report boar sightings using a dedicated mobile phone app. Then, these specialist response teams are deployed directly into the neighborhoods.
Right.
They track the boars down, use dart guns to tranquilize them right there on the sidewalk or in the park, and then administer a lethal injection.
And it is crucial to emphasize the geography of this. This isn't happening deep in some secluded forest preserve on the edge of town.
Wow.
This is being executed in the exact residential zones we just talked about?
Literally near children's playgrounds.
Yeah.
And the aftermath is horrific. Our sources show that these massive carcasses are literally being dumped into standard municipal wheelie bins.
Oh, man.
Just standard garbage bins. The sheer indignity of that visual, you can completely understand the accusations of cruelty and disrespect.
Absolutely.
It has sparked massive protests outside City Hall, with animal rights campaigners and everyday citizens demanding humane alternatives. I mean, Dorota Sumieszka, she's a prominent veterinarian and columnist in Poland. She didn't mince words at all. She called the entire operation outright barbaric.
Yeah, the emotional weight of this really cannot be overstated. There was one specific incident in the Białogard district that perfectly encapsulates why the public is so outraged.
Oh, I read about that.
Yeah, a cull took place near a school for autistic children. The boars were reportedly just sleeping beneath a tree.
Just sleeping.
Just sleeping.
Yeah.
And they were killed rapidly using the darts and injections right there in that highly sensitive, highly visible environment.
It's devastating to even visualize that. And yet you have city officials like Karol Pogorski defending the operation.
Right.
He argues that leaders have a fundamental responsibility to protect people and property. And he specifically claimed that non-lethal methods are used whenever possible. But I have to stop on that point.
Yeah.
If non-lethal methods are supposedly prioritized, why are residents witnessing sleeping animals being euthanized and thrown into garbage bins next to special needs schools?
It's a glaring contradiction.
There's a massive discrepancy between the official bureaucratic talking points and the visceral reality on the ground.
What's fascinating here is the psychological mechanism at play. What we are witnessing is the profoundly jarring effect of applying rural wildlife management tactics in highly visible, sensitive urban spaces.
Right, because normally this happens out of sight.
Exactly. Think about it in a traditional forest management scenario. A population cull is largely invisible to the general public. It happens miles away from playgrounds, away from our daily commutes, hidden by the tree line.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. But when you execute that exact same methodology on a concrete city street, it completely shatters the illusion of separation between human spaces and wild spaces. It forces citizens to confront the raw, brutal reality of population control face to face.
Which is incredibly traumatic.
Yeah.
And it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. If the city's hands are tied and the residents are being deeply traumatized by these brutal, highly visible culls, how did it get this bad in the first place?
Right.
I mean, 3,000 massive wild animals don't just migrate to a major metropolitan center overnight.
No, they don't. And this is where we have to look at the urban ecology, because Warsaw is experiencing an ecological perfect storm. It is a cascading failure of biology, human error, and bureaucracy.
Okay, let's break that down.
We can actually break it down into 7 core factors, starting with the biology. Historically, a disease called African swine fever acted as a brutal but natural population control for wild boars across Europe.
Right, so it kept the numbers manageable in the wild.
Exactly. But since 2017, experts have tracked a genetic bottleneck. The disease killed off all the weaker animals, leaving behind a population with significantly increased resistance.
Oh, wow.
With that natural biological check removed, their survival rates just skyrocketed. We essentially have a super resilient genetic line of boars now.
Wait, okay, so the disease stopped killing them, which explains the population boom. But why the sudden urban invasion? Like, they could have just stayed in the woods with their new super genes.
Well,
I remember reading about the anthropause during the early COVID lockdowns where they just emboldened because we all went inside for a year.
that is exactly the second factor. Think of wildlife like water finding cracks in a pavement. When human movement drastically reduced during the lockdowns, the boars, who are incredibly opportunistic and intelligent foragers, began probing deeper into urban areas.
Because it was empty.
Right. They found the empty pathways, they learned the layout of the streets, and they realized it was quiet and safe. And here's the crucial part. When human activity returned, the boars didn't retreat.
They just stayed.
They just adapted to flowing around the new obstacles. They had already claimed the territory.
They realized this city was prime real estate. But if they're in the city, why doesn't the government just, trap them and truck them back out to the country?
And that brings us to the bureaucracy side of this storm. It turns out European Union regulations actively prevent the relocation of urban boars back into the forests.
It's an EU law.
Yes, it's a strict biosecurity measure.
Because of the African swine fever you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. The virus is incredibly hardy. It can survive in carcasses and soil for long periods. If you trap an urban boar that might be an asymptomatic carrier and release it into a pristine forest environment, you risk introducing a pathogen that could decimate not just wild populations, but entire agricultural sectors.
Oh, because it could spread to domestic pigs.
Exactly. The EU essentially threw up a legal firewall. Once a boar is in the city, it legally cannot leave.
That is wild.
Yeah.
So the city is legally blocked from evicting them. And once they're stuck in the city, we hit the human error component, right? Because a modern city is basically an incredibly dense, high-calorie buffet. Our waste management systems, our open dumpsters. It's a calorie gold mine compared to spending all day rooting around in a harsh, frozen forest just to find, like, a few acorns.
And we make it even easier for them. The situation is massively exacerbated by well-meaning but completely misguided residents who are actively feeding the animals.
Why do we do this?
Yeah.
I mean, you see a 200-pound wild animal with massive tusks, and someone's first instinct is, oh, let me toss it half my sandwich.
I know, it sounds crazy. It stems from a deep-seated human instinct to nurture, to connect with nature. But in an urban ecology context, it is disastrous. It completely removes the animal's natural, healthy fear of humans.
Right.
It creates a behavioral loop where the animal associates people directly with high-value food rewards. This is the exact mechanism that leads to the aggressive encounters, the territorial behavior, and the dog attacks we discussed earlier.
We are literally training them to walk up to us and demand food. Okay, so we have resilient biology, the COVID lockdown effect, legal roadblocks from the EU, the dumpster buffet, and people actively feeding them. That's 5 factors. But what about the weather? Because winters in Poland are notoriously brutal. Shouldn't the cold be keeping the population down?
Historically, yes. A harsh, freezing winter is a brutal but highly effective population control. The ground freezes solid, they can't root for food, and a significant percentage of young piglets simply wouldn't survive the season.
Okay.
But with climate change, the winters in Poland are noticeably milder. Furthermore, cities generate an urban heat island effect. Concrete and asphalt trap heat, meaning the ground in Warsaw doesn't freeze the way the forest does.
So they can root for food year-round.
Exactly. Because the environment is warmer and calories are unlimited, almost an entire litter of piglets can survive to adulthood, whereas before maybe only 1 or 2 would make it. The survival rates jump exponentially.
That makes perfect sense. And to top it all off, factor number 7, there's absolutely zero natural predation in the city. In the deep forests, boars have to constantly remain vigilant against wolves and bears. But downtown Warsaw, there are no wolves roaming the Mokotów district. The apex predator has been completely removed from the equation.
In urban ecology, we actually have a specific term for animals that adapt this way. We call them synanthropes.
Synanthropes.
Yeah, wild animals that actively benefit from living in close proximity to human habitats.
Usually when I hear that, I think of rats or pigeons.
Right, classic examples. But what we are witnessing now is the forced evolution of megafauna synanthropes. These boars aren't just lost in the city. They haven't wandered in by mistake and are desperately trying to find their way out.
They're locals now.
Exactly. They move confidently through these urban spaces because they have learned, generationally, that cities are actually safer, warmer, and vastly more resource-rich than the wild ever was.
So we essentially built the perfect habitat for them and then legally locked them inside it.
That's the tragic irony of it.
That is a wild thought. But apparently, Warsaw is not an isolated incident. When you pull back and look at the global context from our sources, this is a much broader problem. Cities in Spain, Germany, France, and Estonia are all aggressively trying to manage their own booming urban boar populations.
Yeah, it's happening all over Europe.
Even the UK is dealing with this, specifically in the Forest of Dean.
The UK is a fascinating example because it's an island ecosystem. It's a closed loop. They don't have natural predator migration coming in from neighboring countries like mainland Europe does.
Right.
If they don't manually cull the population annually, the boars will quite literally consume every available resource in that localized environment until it collapses. It demonstrates that the friction we are seeing in Warsaw is just a microcosm of a global systemic shift.
But, as serious and analytical as all this is, here's where the human element gets really interesting. Because when people face a complex, bureaucratic, ecological crisis, we don't always react in the most logical way.
No, we definitely don't.
We react weirdly. There was this incredibly bizarre twist in the Warsaw story that went totally viral online.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
It was footage of a humanoid robot, a literal, mechanical, sci-fi-looking robot named Edward Warchaki, aggressively chasing wild boars through a Warsaw parking lot.
I saw that footage. The local authorities actually had to release an official public statement clarifying that no, this vigilante robot is not part of the city's official municipal culling operation.
I just can't get over the sheer absurdity of it. You have citizens protesting the dark guns, you have the city completely bound by EU biosecurity law, and somewhere in the middle of this bureaucratic nightmare, some frustrated tech-savvy resident deployed a remote-controlled robot named Edward to just sprint after these massive animals in a parking garage.
It is utterly surreal, but conceptually, it perfectly symbolizes the bizarre intersection of modern urban life and untamed nature. Think about the imagery we're deploying, cutting-edge science fiction robotics to chase away one of the most ancient, primitive forest animals in existence.
It really is a clash of eras.
It's almost comical. But on a deeper level, it speaks to a profound feeling of helplessness among the public. When the official state apparatus is paralyzed by a combination of laws, budget constraints, and intense moral scrutiny, a massive vacuum of action is created.
And people will just fill that vacuum.
Exactly. People will look for their own, sometimes absurd, solutions to regain a sense of control over their environment.
You feel completely powerless against a 200-pound prehistoric animal destroying your property, so, you send in the robot.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for Warsaw in the long run? When you look at the whole picture we've painted today, the city is completely trapped in an impossible vice. On one side, you have very legitimate, terrifying public safety concerns. Dogs being attacked, cars being wrecked, kids at playgrounds living feet away from unpredictable wild megafauna.
Right.
And on the other side, you have a deeply rooted, highly vocal moral outrage over the trauma of watching these animals be slaughtered and thrown in trash bins on the street where you live.
And that trap is only going to tighten. The ecological mechanisms driving this, the milder winters, the urban heat islands, the adaptable synanthropic behaviors we talked about, none of those factors are reversing.
They're only getting more pronounced.
Exactly. Which raises a critical question, and it's something you really need to deeply consider as we look toward the future of global infrastructure. As climate change continues to soften our winters, and as our cities continue to sprawl ever outward, encroaching further into natural habitats, the traditional boundary line between what we call the wild and what we call the urban is completely erasing.
The line is just gone.
It is gone. So if our current toolkit for dealing with this overlap is limited to either traumatizing lethal culls that tear communities apart or viral vigilante robots chasing animals through parking lots, we are severely ill-equipped.
Yeah, those can't be the only two options.
How will we need to fundamentally redesign our future cities, our waste management architectures, and our municipal laws to actually coexist with the megafauna that are inevitably moving in to stay? Because the Boars have clearly figured out how to live with us.
They figured it out perfectly.
We just haven't figured out how to live with them.
That is such a heavy, critical point to leave on. The Boars adapted to the concrete jungle, and now we are the ones who have to adapt. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We really hope this exploration gives you a totally new perspective the next time you walk out your apartment door, take a sip of that morning coffee, and look toward your local park. Keep exploring, keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you, and we will see you on the next deep dive.
Okay, one question for you. Should Warsaw continue the mass wild boar cull to protect residents, or should authorities invest in humane relocation and long-term wildlife management instead of kill-on-site measures? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.